Jake had always liked the open road. The feel of the cool wind against his face, the steady rumble of the engine, and the quiet freedom of riding at night gave him peace that few things in life could offer. On this particular evening, the highway stretched long and empty, only lit by the pale glow of the moon. Jake leaned forward on his bike, his jacket pulled tight, and let his thoughts wander as the miles slipped by. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any rules. He was simply enjoying the quiet ride after a long day, but not everyone saw it that way. A few miles back, a pair of patrol officers had been parked near a small gas station, sipping coffee and talking about the slow night. When they saw Jake's motorcycle pass by, they exchanged a quick glance. Something about the rider caught their attention. Maybe it was the powerful bike, maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself. Whatever it was, suspicions stirred in their minds. "Let's check him out," one officer said, starting the car. The red and blue lights flickered to life, cutting through the stillness of the night. Jake noticed the glow in his side mirror. He sighed softly and slowed down. He had nothing to hide, so he carefully pulled his bike over to the side of the road. The officers stepped out, one holding a flashlight that danced across Jake's leather jacket and helmet. "License and registration," the first officer said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jake removed his helmet, revealing a calm face with steady eyes. He handed over his documents without hesitation. "Sure, officer," he said politely. His voice was calm, almost too calm for someone being stopped on a lonely stretch of road. The second officer circled around the bike, expecting it as if searching for something wrong. "Where are you headed this late?" he asked. Jake looked at him steadily. "I'm on my way to a friend's place, a couple of towns over," he replied. "Just passing through." But his simple answer didn't seem to satisfy them. The first officer frowned, scanning Jake's license carefully. "What's the rush at this hour?" "No rush," Jake said with a small shrug. "Just enjoying the ride. It clears my head." The officers exchanged glances. To them, something didn't add up. Why would a lone biker be riding so late at night? Why did he seem so calm, almost unbothered by being stopped? The second officer crossed his arms. "You know, we've had reports of troublemakers on bikes coming through here. Loud engines, reckless driving, causing issues in town. You wouldn't happen to be one of them, would you?" Jake met his gaze evenly. "No, sir. I don't cause trouble." But the officers weren't convinced. They began asking more questions: where he worked, why he wasn't traveling by car, whether the bike really belonged to him. Jake answered everything calmly and respectfully, though inside he felt a slight ache of disappointment. He had served his country, given years of his life to protecting others. And now, here he was treated like a suspect for simply riding a motorcycle at night. Still, he kept his tone respectful. "Officers, I think you've mistaken me for someone else. I've done nothing wrong." The first officer smirked faintly. "That's what they all say." Jake paused for a moment. He didn't want to argue, but he also didn't want this to go further than it needed to. So he added quietly, "You should know. Stopping me like this might not turn out the way you think. I have people who care where I am tonight. If I don't show up soon, they'll come looking." The officers chuckled, not taking him seriously. "Oh yeah," the second officer said. "Who's going to come looking for you at this hour?" Jake simply looked at them with steady eyes. "You'll see," he said softly. The officers didn't like his confidence. To them, it sounded like arrogance. They pressed him harder, asking him to step away from the bike, checking his jacket pockets, even shining their flashlight into the small saddlebag on the side of his motorcycle. But all they found was a bottle of water, a folded map, and a few personal items. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal. The quiet road felt tense. Cars rarely passed at this hour, so it was just Jake, the two officers, and the hum of the police car engine. The night air grew colder, and the moon slipped behind a patch of clouds. The officers were starting to feel uneasy. They couldn't quite put their finger on it. Something about this man wasn't ordinary. Jake stood patiently, his helmet under one arm, his bike gleaming faintly under the streetlight. He wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He was just waiting. Waiting for what he already knew was coming. The first officer leaned against the hood of the car, glancing at Jake. "You think you're special or something?" he asked. Jake didn't answer right away. He thought about the years he had spent overseas, the brothers he had fought beside, the weight of responsibility he had carried. He thought about the men who would stand for him without question, because he had once stood for them in moments of life and death. Finally, he replied softly, "No, sir. I don't think I'm special. But I know the people who stand with me do." The officers shook their heads, dismissing his words as nonsense. To them, he was just another biker trying to act tough. But Jake stayed calm, almost serene, as if he had seen this kind of doubt before. And deep inside, he knew it was only a matter of time before the stillness of the night would be broken by the sound of engines, much louder than his bike. Engines that carried men who would not hesitate to come if he didn't arrive where he was expected. For now, though, he stood quietly by the roadside, letting the officers think they had control. The truth was, the balance of power was about to shift in a way they couldn't imagine. The officers continued to question Jake as the quiet night stretched on. Their voices carried an edge of authority, but beneath it, there was a trace of doubt. They couldn't figure out why this man seemed so calm. Most people who got stopped on a lonely road at midnight showed nervousness, frustration, or even fear. But Jake just stood there, steady and collected, as if he had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. One officer circled back around the bike for the third time, running his flashlight over the shiny chrome parts, the wheels, the license plate. "Where exactly are you coming from?" he asked again. Jake met his eyes without flinching. "From a nearby base town," he said. "Stopped for some gas and food, then got back on the road." The first officer, leaning against the car, raised his eyebrow. "Base town? You mean the military base?" Jake gave a small nod. Yes, that one word seemed to bother them. The officers weren't sure if he was bluffing or if there was more to this story than he was letting on. They pressed harder. "You expect us to believe you were just casually riding around at midnight, passing through small towns, and it's all innocent." The officer said with a faint laugh, "That doesn't sound right." Jake's calm expression never wavered. "I told you the truth. I don't expect you to believe me right away, but I promise you're making a mistake if you think I'm here to cause trouble." The second officer scoffed, shaking his head. "We've been dealing with bikers who roar through here, scare the locals, and speed on the highway. You fit the picture perfectly." "I don't fit the picture," Jake answered firmly, though still respectful. "I've never caused trouble here or anywhere else, but I understand how it looks to you. You see the bike, the jacket, the hour of the night? You think I must be one of them? But that's not who I am." There was something in his tone of quiet strength, a kind of certainty that unsettled the officers. They wanted to dismiss him, but they couldn't shake the feeling that he was telling the truth. Still, pride kept them going. They didn't want to admit they might be wrong. The officer with the flashlight tapped the bike's handlebar and frowned. "Look, man, you're acting too calm. Like you've got something up your sleeve. What's your deal?" Jake paused for a long moment. He weighed his words carefully because he knew whatever he said now would stick in their minds. Finally, he said softly, "I told you before, if I don't reach where I'm supposed to be, people will come looking. You think I'm bluffing, but I'm not. I'm not trying to scare you, but I want you to understand you've stopped the wrong bike tonight." The officers laughed again, but their laughter was thinner now, forced. "What's that supposed to mean?" the first officer demanded. Jake looked straight at him, his voice steady. "It means you're focusing on the wrong person. You think I'm a stranger, but I'm not alone. If I'm delayed too long, others will know. And when they come, you'll realize I was telling the truth." For a moment, silence hung in the air. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. They weren't sure what to think. Was this man just playing games, trying to sound important? Or was he really connected to something bigger? To break the tension, the second officer smirked and said, "What are you, some kind of celebrity? A big shot we should be worried about?" Jake's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Not a celebrity. Nothing like that. Just someone who's earned a certain kind of trust. And trust is stronger than fame." His words lingered in the cold air, heavy and unsettling. The officers tried to shake it off, but their instincts told them they were missing something. Still, they kept pushing. They ran his license through their radio system, checked his registration, asked about his background. Everything came back clean. No criminal record. No outstanding tickets. Nothing suspicious. That in itself made them even more uneasy. Usually, when someone was this calm, there was a catch. Finally, the first officer sighed and crossed his arms. "Look, we don't want to keep you here all night, but you're not free to go yet. You're going to stay put until we're satisfied." Jake gave a respectful nod. "That's your choice. But I'm telling you, time is ticking. My people are punctual." The second officer leaned against the patrol car, shaking his head. "Your people? Who exactly are these people you keep talking about?" Jake didn't answer directly. He looked out at the dark highway, listening to the faint hum of the night. "They're men who don't leave one of their own behind. That's all you need to know." The officers were growing impatient. To them it sounded like riddles. Yet deep down, they felt a strange unease. Something was about to happen. Something they weren't prepared for. As the minutes passed, the night air grew heavier. The officers' confidence began to waver. They were used to being in control, but Jake's composure unsettled them. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't plead. He just stood tall, steady, waiting. One officer finally muttered under his breath, "What if he's telling the truth?" The other frowned. "About what? That an army's going to roll up here? Come on, man. Don't tell me you're buying into that." But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. Something about Jake didn't feel like an ordinary biker. His calmness, his choice of words, the way he carried himself at all hinted at a man who had seen far more serious situations than a midnight traffic stop. And then, as the officers tried to shake off the unease, Jake quietly adjusted his jacket and glanced at his watch. He didn't say anything, but his small movement sent a ripple of tension through the moment. He wasn't bluffing. He was simply waiting for the clock to catch up. The officers didn't know it yet. But their night was about to change in a way they would never forget. The night had grown colder, and the two officers were beginning to lose patience. They had run Jake's information twice, checked every detail on their system, and found nothing to hold against him. Yet something in them refused to let go. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fact that Jake's quiet confidence felt like a challenge. They weren't used to people staying so calm under their authority. Jake stood by his bike, helmet in hand, his expression unchanged. He wasn't angry. He wasn't nervous. He was simply waiting. Every so often, he glanced toward the distant stretch of road behind him, as if he knew something was coming. The first officer finally muttered, "You're wasting our time. You think you can spook us with your little story? Nothing's happening." Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he checked the time on his watch again, then looked up at the night sky. The moon was slipping through a patch of clouds, casting a pale silver light over the quiet highway. When he finally spoke, his words were steady. "Give it a few more minutes." The officers exchanged puzzled looks. One shook his head in frustration. "This guy's messing with us," he whispered to his partner. But then, before either of them could say another word, a low rumble echoed in the distance. At first it was faint, blending in with the wind. But as the seconds passed, the sound grew louder, heavier, and unmistakable. It was not the sound of a single vehicle. It was the sound of many engines rolling down the highway. The second officer straightened, his hand instinctively going to the flashlight. "What's that?" he asked, trying to mask the unease in his voice. Jake's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "That," he said quietly, "is what I was telling you about." The rumble grew stronger, shaking the stillness of the night. The officers turned toward the highway, their eyes widening as headlights appeared in the darkness, first two, then four, then an entire line stretching across the road. A convoy of military Humvees was approaching, their beams cutting sharp paths through the night. The sound of engines filled the air, steady and powerful. Nothing like the occasional car that passed through this lonely stretch. The officers froze. For a moment, they didn't know whether to believe what they were seeing. But the truth was undeniable. One by one, the Humvees slowed as they reached the flashing police car lights. Tires crunched against the gravel shoulder as the vehicles pulled over in formation. The convoy stretched long, at least 50 soldiers strong. Each Humvee loaded with disciplined men in uniform. The lead Humvee stopped directly in front of Jake's motorcycle. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in full uniform, his posture commanding, his presence undeniable. He wore the bars of a captain on his shoulders, and his expression was firm, unreadable. The captain walked straight toward the officers, his boots striking the ground with purpose. Behind him, soldiers climbed out of their vehicles, forming a line as if they had rehearsed this moment. Their movements were sharp, disciplined, and full of quiet authority. The officers' confidence melted instantly. Their faces turned pale as the captain stopped in front of them. For a long second, he said nothing, simply looking from one officer to the other. The weight of his gaze was enough to silence them completely. Finally, his voice rang out, strong and measured. "Why is this man being stopped?" he asked, gesturing toward Jake. The first officer stammered, caught off guard. We thought he looked suspicious." "Just a routine check, sir." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious?" His tone carried sharp disbelief. He turned toward Jake, who gave him a respectful nod, and then back to the officers. "Do you have any idea who you've pulled over?" The second officer swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "No, sir. We didn't know." The captain stepped closer, his presence towering. "This man," he said firmly, "is not just another rider on a bike. He's a decorated veteran. He's a man who has stood shoulder to shoulder with us, who has saved more lives than you can count. He has earned our respect, and when he doesn't arrive where he's expected, we come looking. That's why you see us here tonight." The soldiers behind him stood tall, their eyes fixed forward, their silence speaking louder than words. The officers looked around, stunned by the sight of so many men ready to stand for Jake. Jake himself remained quiet, his calm demeanor unchanged. He hadn't asked for a display of power, but he knew this was what loyalty looked like. The soldiers weren't here to intimidate. They were here because he was one of their own. The captain's voice grew even sharper. "You thought he was just another biker? You thought you could treat him however you liked because it was late at night on a quiet road? That was your mistake. You stopped the wrong bike." The words cut deep. The officers lowered their heads, realizing how badly they had misjudged the situation. They had treated Jake like a suspect, never once imagining he was a man of honor, someone the army itself would move to protect. The silence stretched heavy across the road. The soldiers stood firm, their vehicles lined like guardians in the night. The air vibrated with the quiet hum of engines, each one a reminder of the strength behind the man who had stood calmly by his bike all this time. Jake finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "I told you I wasn't alone. I never am." The officers had no response. For the first time that night, they truly saw Jake not as a rider, not as a suspect, but as someone who carried history, respect, and loyalty wherever he went. The captain gave a sharp nod to Jake, then turned back to the officers. "This ends now. You will step back, and you will remember tonight. Not because you were embarrassed, but because you were taught a lesson about respect." The officers nodded quickly, their pride broken. They stepped aside, their flashlights hanging limply at their sides. Jake placed his helmet back on his head. But before mounting his bike, he paused and looked at the officers. "I don't hold grudges," he said softly. "But I hope you think twice before judging a man by his bike or his jacket. Sometimes there's more to a person than you can see." And with that, the captain signaled his men. The convoy stood ready, waiting for Jake to ride. The night, once empty and silent, now pulsed with the presence of 50 soldiers who had arrived not with anger, but with loyalty, discipline, and the unspoken message that no one is ever truly alone when they have earned the respect of those who serve beside them. The convoy stood silently along the highway, the soldiers forming a steady line beside their Humvees. The flashing lights of the police car no longer felt like a sign of authority. Instead, they looked out of place in the presence of men who carried real discipline and respect in their posture. The two officers shifted uncomfortably. Realizing they had lost control of the situation, The moment those headlights appeared, the captain stepped closer to Jake, his voice lowering but still carrying strength. "We were worried," he said, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "You didn't arrive when you were supposed to. We don't let one of our own disappear into the night without checking." Jake gave him a respectful nod. "I told them you'd come," he said calmly. The captain's jaw tightened as he turned back toward the officers. They stood stiffly, unsure of what to do with their hands. Pride still clung to them, but their confidence had melted. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" the captain asked again, his tone sharper than before. The first officer swallowed. "Sir, no. We didn't know." "Of course you didn't," the captain said. "Because you judged him the moment you saw the bike. You looked at his jacket, the time of night, and you thought you already knew his story. But you were wrong." The soldiers behind him remained silent, their discipline unshaken. The night air carried the weight of the captain's words, pressing down on the officers harder than any punishment could. "This man," the captain continued, pointing to Jake, "has stood in places you cannot imagine. He has carried men out of fire when everyone else thought it was over. He has made choices that saved lives, not once, not twice, but many times. There are soldiers standing right here in front of you who would not be alive if it weren't for him." The second officer's eyes widened slightly as he glanced at Jake. The calmness that had unsettled them now made sense. It wasn't arrogance. It was the steady peace of someone who had already faced life at its hardest. The captain's voice grew firmer. "When he rides down a road, he doesn't ride alone. Every man who served with him rides with him in spirit. Every life he saved follows him. That's why when he doesn't arrive where he's supposed to be, we come. Because loyalty is not a word to us, it's a promise." The officers stood frozen, their earlier smirks and doubts long gone. Jake finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying power. "I didn't want this to happen. I just wanted a quiet ride. But you stopped me, and you treated me like a problem when I was never one. All I asked was for you to believe me when I said you were making a mistake." The first officer opened his mouth to reply, but quickly shut it again. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound hollow. The captain took a step closer, his tone softer now but still commanding. "Do you know what it feels like to carry men out of danger? To see fear in their eyes, and know they're looking at you for hope? Jake knows. And because of that, every soldier here owes him something. He doesn't brag about it. He doesn't carry medals in his pocket to prove it. He simply lives quietly, like he always has. And yet you thought he was a troublemaker." The soldiers shifted slightly, their boots scraping the ground in unison, as if to underline the captain's words. Their presence wasn't for intimidation, it was for Jake, a reminder that true respect is earned, not demanded. The officers finally lowered their heads. "We're sorry," the first officer muttered. His voice was almost too quiet to hear. The captain let the silence hang for a long moment before replying. "Sorry doesn't undo judgment. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you looked at a man and assumed the worst. You're lucky he has more patience than most. You're lucky he understands what forgiveness means." Jake's calm eyes met theirs. "I forgive you," he said simply. "But I hope you remember tonight every time you think about stopping someone just because of how they look. Not every man who rides a bike is reckless. Not every late-night traveler is a criminal. Sometimes, the quietest man you meet is the one who's carried the heaviest load." The officers nodded quickly, their embarrassment clear. The captain looked back at Jake, his stern expression softening slightly. "We'll escort you the rest of the way. You've done enough for us, we'll make sure no one troubles you again tonight." "Shh." Jake shook his head lightly. "That's not necessary. I can handle myself." The captain's voice left no room for argument. "It's not about handling yourself. It's about honoring you. Let us do this." Jake gave a small nod of acceptance. He slipped his helmet back on, the motion smooth and unhurried. His bike gleamed faintly under the convoy's headlights, its engine ready to roar back to life, as he swung his leg over the seat. The soldiers subtly straightened, a silent show of respect. To them, Jake wasn't just a rider. He was a brother, a protector, a man whose quiet presence spoke louder than words. The captain gave one final look to the officers. "Remember tonight. Remember what respect looks like when it's earned. and remember the difference between judgment and truth." The officer stood still, watching as Jake started his bike. The steady growl of the engine filled the night, mixing with the quiet hum of the Humvees. For the first time since the stop, the officers saw Jake clearly, not as a man on a motorcycle, not as a stranger, but as someone who had lived a story far greater than they could imagine. The convoy began to move, soldiers climbing back into their vehicles with precision. The captain returned to his Humvee, but not before giving Jake a firm nod, a sign of respect that words couldn't capture. Jake eased his bike onto the road, the convoy falling in behind him like guardians. The flashing police lights faded into the distance, replaced by the steady glow of military headlights stretching far into the night. For the two officers, the lesson was carved deep. They knew they would never forget the man they stopped, the mistake they made, and the loyalty that arrived in Humvees to prove them wrong. The sound of Jake's motorcycle carried down the long stretch of road, blending with the deep hum of the military Humvees behind him. The convoy moved like a river of headlights cutting through the dark. The soldiers kept their formation, disciplined and steady. Their vehicles spread across the road in a way that made the scene look almost unreal. For anyone passing by, it would have looked like a high-level military operation. But for Jake, it was simply a reminder that loyalty runs deep, deeper than most people can understand. The officers stood by their patrol car, watching the line of vehicles fade into the night. They didn't move. They didn't even speak at first. The weight of what had just happened hung in the cold air around them. The flashing red and blue lights of their car seemed meaningless now, a small show of authority compared to the silent respect of 50 men who had shown up for one. Finally, the first officer let out a slow breath. "We stopped the wrong man," he admitted quietly. His words were heavy, filled with regret. The second officer nodded, still staring at the dark road. "We judged him before we even knew him. Just a bike, a jacket, and we thought we had him figured out." They both stood silently for a long while, the night suddenly feeling much heavier than before. The image of the captain's stern face, the line of soldiers, and Jake's calm words repeated in their minds. Meanwhile, Jake rode at the front of the convoy, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The night was cool, and the steady roar of his bike mixed with the engines of the Humvees like a chorus of loyalty behind him. He didn't ask for this escort. He never wanted to stand out. But this was who they were, men who never left one of their own behind. Every soldier in those vehicles knew something about Jake. Some had fought with him directly, remembering nights of fire and chaos when Jake had carried wounded men to safety. Others had only heard stories, but they carried those stories like truth. To them, Jake wasn't just a rider. He was a reminder of courage and sacrifice. That's why, when word spread that he hadn't arrived at his destination, they moved out. No hesitation, no questions. Just action. Jake kept his ride steady. Inside, he thought about the stop. He didn't hold anger toward the officers. In his life, he had learned that people often judged quickly, often made assumptions. What mattered wasn't their mistake, it was whether they learned from it. Behind him, the captain drove in the lead Humvee, his eyes sharp on the road, but his thoughts on Jake. He respected the man deeply. Jake never bragged about his past, never sought recognition, yet his actions spoke louder than medals or speeches ever could. That was why the soldiers followed him, even off the battlefield. Respect like that couldn't be forced. It had to be earned in moments when everything was on the line, as they traveled through the quiet night. Townspeople who lived near the highway peeked out from windows, hearing the deep rumble of the convoy. Some thought it was a drill. Some wondered if something dangerous was happening. But none of them knew the truth that this show of power was not about war or defense. It was about loyalty to a single man who had once stood for them. Miles passed until they reached the edge of the town Jake had been heading to. At a wide clearing near a small rest stop, Jake slowed his bike and pulled over. The convoy followed, the Humvees parking neatly in a long line, engines idling in the dark. Soldiers stepped out quietly, their boots hitting the ground in perfect rhythm. Jake removed his helmet and looked around at the men who had come for him. He gave a small smile, the kind that carried gratitude without needing words. The captain approached him, his voice steady but softer than before. "You know you didn't need to ride alone tonight." "You're never alone," Jake nodded. "I know. But sometimes I just want to feel the road. The quiet helps me think." The captain placed a hand on his shoulder. "We understand. But you should also understand we'll always come, no matter what. That's not going to change." Jake looked at him, his eyes reflecting the truth of their bond. "And that's why I can ride peacefully, because I know you're there." The soldiers didn't cheer or speak loudly. They simply stood in formation, silent, strong, and watchful. Their silence was more powerful than any words could be. Back on the highway, the two officers still sat in their patrol car. They hadn't left the spot where the convoy had appeared. Their pride had been shaken, their eyes opened in a way that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The first officer finally spoke again. I thought authority meant power. The badge, the lights, the uniform. But tonight showed me something else. Respect isn't taken, it's earned." The second officer nodded slowly. "And we were quick to judge someone who had earned more respect than we'll probably see in our lifetimes." They drove back to their station in silence, both lost in thought, both carrying the memory of the man on the motorcycle and the 50 soldiers who had stood behind him. For Jake, the night ended quietly. After speaking with the captain, he continued his ride with the convoy, trailing him until he reached his destination safely. They didn't need to say goodbye. Their bond was deeper than words. The soldiers would always be there, and Jake would always carry their loyalty with him. As he parked his bike near the small cabin where he planned to rest, Jake looked up at the night sky. The stars stretched endless above him, and he breathed deeply, feeling peace settle over him once again. He thought about the officers not with bitterness, but with hope. Maybe, just maybe, they'd learned something that night. Maybe they would think twice before letting assumptions guide their actions. And if they remembered nothing else, Jake hoped they would remember the convoy of Humvees, the captain's words, and the quiet strength of loyalty. Because true strength isn't about flashing lights or loud authority. It's about the silent respect that follows a man who has lived with honor. The soldiers eventually departed, their engines fading into the distance, leaving Jake alone with the calm night. He sat on the porch of the cabin, sipping water from his bottle, and let the quiet return. He smiled faintly to himself. He hadn't asked for a show of force, but it reminded him of something important. Life could take you far away from the battlefield, far away from the moments that tested you. But the loyalty you built during those times never disappeared. It stayed, following you like a shadow, ready to rise when you needed it most. That night became more than just a memory for Jake. It became a lesson for everyone who had witnessed it. For the officers, it was a lesson about judgment and humility. For the soldiers, it was a reminder of why they stood together. And for Jake, it was another reminder of the quiet truth he lived by. Respect is never loud, but it is always strong. The road stretched ahead, waiting for the next ride, the next quiet night, the next chapter in his journey, and Jake, calm as ever, was ready for it.